Hey class, welcome back to our new unit on systems. We're going to talk about systems of plants and animals and how they function and their overall structures and components that allow them to be these complex living creatures. To start off, we're looking at plant reproduction in the reproductive systems, and we'll specifically focus on angiosperms or flowering plants. One discussion, or two discussion questions really, that we'll talk about in class is a seed alive and is a fruit alive? So something to think about as you're taking notes on these components of plants. The first section here that I just want to highlight with you guys is a sketch, a diagram, a drawing. I want you to draw and label each part of the flower below in your notebooks. This is going to be something we're going to use to reference back. So make sure that you have all these components labeled. The ones in the brackets obviously contain what's underneath them. So for example, the stamen is made of an anther and a filament, right, which is this long piece here. The carpel or pistil, we're going to use those interchangeably. There's a slight difference, but not something we'll get into necessarily in class. So if you see either of those terms, we're referring to this whole middle structure here, made up of the stigma, style, and ovary. Flower petals, that's the one structure I hope you already know, and the sepal are those small petals below. So stop, pause the video, draw, and label. We'll reference that in class. So the first complex process we'll be talking about is kind of shown as a overall animation. Here is the process of fertilization of a plant or a flower and creating these structures of fruits essentially. So the overall process, pollen has to land on the stigma at the very top. A pollen tube is going to grow down into the ovary. It's going to fertilize the ovules, and then this entire ovary swells and ripens into a fruit, and the ovules become seeds. This is the process of fertilization. This is step-by-step outlined here, talking about why we would call it double fertilization, because in this final stage, 2 sperm cells fertilize structures within this ovary, one with the egg cell in particular, and one with the central cell. So we get those 2 fertilizations occurring. So what is happening once this flower grows? It develops all of those complex structures that we sketched, and then it starts to use those structures to create a fruit. So the ovary develops into the fruit of the plant, and I like this diagram because we can see, okay, here's our ovary right here, this thick wall. So what happens to the ovary? Well, the ovary develops into the outside flesh of the pepper, so that wall, and then the entire ovary itself, this big structure, becomes the fruit. Within the fruit needs to be the seeds, and the seeds are those fertilized ovules that are present inside the ovary. So if we look at a pepper, we can kind of see all these major structures at play here. Right, so the ovary wall is the outside, the ovary itself is this big structure that's swollen, and then the individual seeds here. One thing about fruits, classification is determined by having seeds. So understanding something like a pepper, a lot of people would say, oh, that's a vegetable, that's a fruit. Okay, something even like a cucumber, right? A cucumber is a fruit because it has seeds. So that's our classification system when we talk about scientifically what's a fruit or a vegetable. The next thing we'll look at is the process of ovule to seed. So a fertilized ovule becomes the seed of the plant. This is part of that double fertilization process. So remember that we have our zygote being formed, they're diploid, and then they turn into the embryo of the seed. And then within the seed we have the central cell, which becomes fertilized, and that becomes an endosperm. So this is how a seed, or the fertilized ovule itself, this structure becomes a seed that can then develop into a whole entirely separate plant. What starts this whole process? Pollination, right? Pollination can occur by wind or animals primarily. So understand that the pollen has to be blown from the anther itself onto the stigma, and that can happen through self-fertilization, so one plant fertilizing itself, or it can happen across a given area. Sometimes it's very local. In the case of wind pollination, it's most likely. But if it's animal pollination, they can be carried great distances, which give us some genetic variation and diversity. The purpose of flower petals is to be more showy and allow organisms to be attracted, or these pollinators to be attracted to the flower, to bring them to the pollen, and give them a little bit of a little bit of nectar, a little bit of energy, a little bit of reason to come there. So that's why things like bees, ants, butterflies, moths are pollinators, because they're coming there for some resource they need, and as a result, the plants are giving them this energy, in turn that they're gonna, go out and pollinate other flowers and pass on their genetic material. Pollination is a big deal. Without pollinators, bees in particular, we talk about losing $217 billion a year. So these bees are doing this pollination of our crops, these food sources that we eat, all for free for the most part, right? So they don't know they're doing it, but they are, and they're important. So we should take care of them and our environment, keep them alive. Seed germination, just wanted to show you kind of how a seed develops in the soil. I think it's a unique, you won't need to know any specifics necessarily about structures, but understand that we start developing a root system first, then we start driving up, reaching for the sky. At this point, as a review, we did a pea germination lab. Cellular respiration is the process they're undergoing here until they develop structures above ground to do photosynthesis and capture the sunlight energy and carbon dioxide to grow and develop and create that glucose that they put into all these structures. So cellular respiration here, and then photosynthesis once we get those leafy green structures that can develop and do photosynthesis.